So today we're going to really get into this Supreme Court case, Smith v. Spisak. It's a pretty wild one, death penalty, Sixth Amendment right to counsel. It all kind of comes crashing together.
Yeah, and what strikes me, I always find it interesting that we tend to talk about these cases as, big legal concepts, but this one really gets personal. Like, we're talking about the life of Frank Spisak Jr., a guy who was convicted of really horrific crimes.
Yeah, I was reading through the sources you sent over, and it's hard to even stomach some of the things that he did. He called them seek and destroy missions, but they were really just racially motivated attacks in Cleveland back in '82.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Smith v. Spisak, you'll hear it mentioned a lot when people talk about the death penalty and legal representation. But to really grasp it, like, you have to confront just how awful Spisak's crimes were. He wasn't just some petty thief.
So can we just lay it all out? Like, what exactly did he do?
So Spisak's crimes were just brutal. Between February and August of 1982, he murdered Reverend Horace Rickerson, shot him 7 times. John Hardaway, same thing, shot 7 times. And then there's the case of 17-year-old Brian Warford shot in the head.
God, it's just awful to think about what those families went through.
Absolutely. And then you have Coletta Dart. She actually managed to escape, but not before Spisak fired shots at her, just because he thought she'd said something bad about the Nazi Party.
Wow. So this wasn't just random violence. It was like targeted hatred.
You got it. And Spisak didn't exactly try to hide his extremism.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources you sent over mention he even grew a Hitler mustache and carried Mein Kampf around during his trial. Like, he wanted to make a statement.
Chilling. Makes you wonder, how did all that hatred, how did that play into his legal defense?
That's where it gets interesting, because even with all the awfulness of what he did, Spisak still had the right to appeal his death sentence. And his appeals really hinged on 2 big Supreme Court precedents, Mills v. Maryland and Strickland v. Washington.
Okay, let's break those down a little. So Mills v. Maryland, that one's about how juries are supposed to consider mitigating factors when they're deciding on a sentence, right?
You got it. Spisak argued that the way the jury was instructed in his case was messed up. He said they didn't give the jury enough room to think about things that might make his sentence less severe. Like maybe his mental state, his childhood, whatever. He was basically saying the instructions were rigged against him from the start.
And then Strickland v. Washington, that sets the bar for proving you had a bad lawyer, right? Like, ineffective assistance of counsel is the term.
Right. That was Spisak's other big argument. He claimed his lawyer's closing arguments during sentencing were so bad, so weak, that they basically poisoned the jury against him, saying his own lawyer screwed him over, which would be a huge violation of his Sixth Amendment rights.
So it's not just did he do it, but was he treated fairly when he was sentenced? It sounds like this could have had huge implications for death penalty cases going forward. So what happened? What happened next?
Well, this wasn't a quick case. It started with appeals in Ohio, all denied. But Spisak kept fighting. He filed for habeas corpus, which is basically a legal way to say my imprisonment is wrong. You got to let me go.
Well, like a get-out-of-jail-free card almost?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And get this, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals actually agreed with Spisak. They stopped his execution. They felt like there were some serious problems with how his trial went down.
Wow. So it looked like he might actually get off death row?
Yeah, it did seem like that. But then the Supreme Court stepped in, took up the case, they called it Hudson v. Spisak, and sent it back to the Sixth Circuit to look at it again. The highest court was like, hold up, we need to take a closer look at this.
So back down to the Sixth Circuit. Did they change their minds after the Supreme Court kind of poked them?
Nope, they held their ground, doubled down even, upheld their original ruling. And that set the stage for the final showdown in the Supreme Court with Smith v. Spisak. And here's where things get really interesting. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision written by Justice Breyer, they actually overturned the Sixth Circuit, not just once, but twice.
Well, they overturned them twice. That's got to be rare, right? Seems like the Supreme Court was making a point.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? They're basically saying, look, we hear the Sixth Circuit, but we disagree. The Supreme Court said Ohio did not violate Spisak's rights with those jury instructions. They said the instructions didn't stop jurors from considering everything they needed to, including stuff that might have gotten him a lighter sentence.
So they weren't buying the argument that the jury was like forced into the death penalty?
Right. And when it came to the lawyers' closing arguments, they said even if there were problems there, and they weren't totally convinced there were, it probably wouldn't have changed the outcome anyway.
That's kind of tricky. Right, it almost sounds like they're saying, well, even if the lawyer messed up, Spisak was so bad, it wouldn't have mattered anyway.
Yeah, that's a valid point. People still argue about it today. There's this quote from Justice Stevens in one of the sources that really gets at what the court was thinking. He said that Spisak had basically alienated and ostracized the jury just by how he acted and what he believed. Hard to imagine any closing argument swaying a jury that had already seen all that extremism.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it also makes you think about the defense attorney's role in a case like this, right? If your client is so clearly guilty and they're not even, sorry, what do you do? Do you try to win no matter what, or do you make sure the process is fair, even if your client gets the worst possible punishment?
Man, that's a tough one. A real ethical dilemma. And lawyers face that kind of thing all the time. The Spisak decision doesn't really give us a clear answer. What it does tell us is that it's really hard to prove ineffective assistance of counsel. The Supreme Court wasn't saying Spisak's lawyer did everything perfectly, just that any mistakes weren't bad enough to throw out the sentence.
So bottom line, after all the appeals and legal wranglings, Spisak stayed on death row.
He did. He actually became Ohio's longest-serving death row inmate at that time. And in 2011, he was executed by lethal injection.
Kind of a grim ending to a long and complicated story. One of the sources mentions his last meal request: spaghetti with tomato sauce, a salad, chocolate cake, and coffee. Strange to think about something so ordinary next to a case like this.
Yes, it kind of reminds you that behind all the legal stuff and the courtroom drama, there's a human being there. And it makes you ask yourself some hard questions, like how do we balance justice for these horrible crimes with the rights of the accused, even when those accused have done truly terrible things?
Right. And the fact this thing went all the way to the Supreme Court not once but twice, that shows how hard it is to find that balance. It wasn't a slam dunk for either side. Smith v. Spisak might seem like just one case, but it brings up so many bigger questions about the death penalty, about legal representation, and about how our system handles these extreme situations.
Absolutely. It's like a microcosm of all these bigger debates. And what's really interesting is there's no one right way to interpret what the Supreme Court did. Some legal experts, they see Smith v. Spisak as saying, look, the death penalty should only be for the absolute worst of the worst.
Meaning we need to be extra careful to make sure those facing the death penalty have the best possible lawyers.
Exactly. But then others might say this case is about the Supreme Court making sure the system works properly, even when it means a really bad guy doesn't get off. They might say the system isn't perfect, but in this case, it did what it was supposed to do.
It's like looking at the same painting from different angles, right? You see different things depending on where you're standing. That's what makes Smith v. Spisak so interesting. It doesn't give you easy answers or simple conclusions. It forces you to really think about the legal system and the moral questions around the death penalty.
So where does all this leave us?
Well,
what are the big takeaways if you're trying to understand Smith v. Spisak?
Yeah, what's the TLDR?
Well, I think it shows you just how important precedent is in these death penalty cases. Mills v. Maryland, Strickland v. Washington, even though they were decided years ago, they still matter a lot today.
Like they're the foundation for everything that comes after.
Exactly. And Smith v. Spisak shows how much those jury instructions matter. Like even little changes in the wording can have a huge impact, especially when it's a life or death situation.
Yeah, and all that back and forth, right? State courts, Sixth Circuit, then the Supreme Court. It just shows you how closely they look at these cases and how many chances you get to appeal. It's a long road.
It really is. And for me, one of the biggest things to remember is that even though the law tries to be objective, there's always a human element. Judges, lawyers, juries, they're all people making decisions that affect other people's lives in really big ways.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the legal stuff and forget there are real people at the heart of this. The sources you sent mentioned that after the Supreme Court ruling, there was some talk about whether Spisak's case might change how jury instructions are written in Ohio death penalty cases.
Right. Smith v. Spisak didn't necessarily change the law, but it definitely got people talking about fairness in these capital punishment cases. They had to look at the language used in those jury instructions and ask, is this really unbiased? Is it clear?
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Smith v. Spisak, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away?
I guess just realizing that the law isn't some set of rules in a book. It's a system that's always evolving based on the cases that come before it. And at the center of those cases, you've got real people going through some really tough stuff.
And Smith v. Spisak shows that in a powerful way. It's so much more than a legal case. It's about life and death and the search for justice in a system that isn't always perfect.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And maybe one last thought for our listeners out there, something to chew on. If Smith v. Spisak went before the Supreme Court today, would it be decided the same way? Would they look at Mills v. Maryland and Strickland v. Washington the same way? Makes you wonder.
Yeah, a lot to think about for sure. Thanks for breaking all this down for us. Until next time, everybody.